And now, from Heaven's Megaphone, this week's edition of the Electric Theater Interview.
Today we have something a little bit different. It's a history lesson, but today we've got something international. None of you out there are going to know much, if anything, about this riveting story, which is going to become a film. In April 2013, it's going to go into release on public TV. It will be shown at film festivals, and I'm sure all kinds of groups across the U.S. And what is this film? It's called Rescue in the Philippines. And today I have with me Barbara Sasser. Barbara is the granddaughter of the leading player in the story, and she's a consultant to the producers. And the producers are Three Roads Communications out of Frederick, Maryland. Now we're going to get into the story. Barbara, welcome to Electric Theater Radio Hour.
Thank you very much, George. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, listen, I've seen the trailer, and it's very compelling. It grabbed my attention right off the bat. It's really exciting. Very well done. Right up there with Ken Burns. We know the quality of this film is going to be first class, but you got to tell us the story. Your granddad, as I mentioned, is the leading player. He was a businessman in the Philippines. He owned a cigar company and had lived there for several years. That was basically home.
Yes, you got the story almost correct. All right, let me give you the background. My grandfather and his brothers were in a family business, a cigar distributorship business. My great-grandfather, Sam Frieder, came to America, as many Jews did, in the late 1800s. He married here and had 7 children. 5 of them were boys, and they were in the company called S. Frieder and Sons. And that was started in New York. But one of the brothers married a wonderful girl from Cincinnati, Ohio, and so he moved to Cincinnati. And then there was a distributorship also, cigar distributorship in Cincinnati as well, and a number of the other brothers followed him. So now we have a brother and a father in New York, and we have 4 brothers in Cincinnati, all in the same cigar business, distributing cigars from all over the world, but a majority of their business were Filipino cigars. What I consider one of the first outsourcing events. They decided to go to the Philippines and see if they could buy the tobacco there, bring it back, make the cigars, and distribute them here. Well, instead, they decided to stay in the Philippines, establish a manufacturing plant there, make the cigars there, and send them back to the States for distribution. But no one in the family wanted to live in the tropics full time. The 4 brothers rotated. Every 2 years, they would take their wives and children, and they would live in the Philippines and run the cigar business for 2 years. And then they would come back, and another brother would rotate there, all living in the same house.
That may have been the first timeshare program, too.
Could be. They began their business in the Philippines in 1920. They stayed, the brothers rotating, through to the late 1930s. And in actuality, they left in early 41. But the events of our film are all about the dates 1937 to 41. And those dates are important because even in the mid-1930s, it was known that European Jews were in trouble, and my family is Jewish. My grandfather and his brothers wanted to do what they could to help European Jews escape the Nazi regime. Living in the Philippines, they thought that might be a place where Jews could go. It could be a haven for Jews. Life in the Philippines was a colonial life. It was an American territory. And in 1935, America had agreed to give the Philippines Commonwealth status on a timeline to give it its independence in 1945. This was before anyone knew the dates that World War II was coming. So in 1935, Manuel Quezon was elected president of the Philippines. He was a very active Catholic. It's a very Catholic country. The highest American official in the Philippines at that time was called a High Commissioner, and that person was Paul McNutt, who's a very interesting character. He was a governor of Indiana. He's a Democrat. He accepted this position in the Philippines. FDR offered it to him. He was a rival of FDR. Paul McNutt wanted to be president, very much he wanted to be president, and he geared his political life towards running for the presidency in 1940. At that time, FDR would have served 2 terms. If FDR had not decided to run for a 3rd term, it's likely that McNutt would have won that election. But Paul McNutt was a Protestant from Indiana, and he found himself in the Philippines. And he and Quezon got along very well. And as American businessmen in an American territory in the Far East, life in pre-war Manila, the evenings was a series of dinners, dances, clubs, poker games, all of which the Frieder family enjoyed very much, as did McNutt and Quezon. And so they were all friends. By 1937, let's say, through these series of poker games we have all kinds of documents from an organization called the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, headquartered in New York, whose job it was to take care of Jews all over the world. They saved all these documents, and we have letters written back and forth from the Frieder family to the Joint Distribution Committee in New York, from McNutt, meetings that occurred in New York, meetings that occurred in the Philippines, all kinds of documentation that say a plan was established between the Frieders, McNutt, and Quezon to allow Jews in starting in 1937.
This was arranged in social settings, like over dinner and playing poker, and this is where they came up with this and got it approved?
Very much so. Very much so. There were weekly, if not more often than that, poker games and bridge games at my grandparents' house, at which we know Eisenhower, MacArthur, McNutt all attended. There were balls. We have photos. There were balls and parties and dinners that all 3 of them were at. We have notes that say Alex Frieder saw the President Quezon, this afternoon at such and such a meeting where it was discussed, blah, blah, blah. Yes, the relationships were established in social situations. I mean, networking is networking. It's, in many cases, it's no different than sort of the golden age of Galveston, or another image that we bring to mind is Casablanca. It's a very international place. People from everywhere enjoying the tropics in a pre-war colonial life. That's the basis. These friendships, these business relationships and respect that grew up were established between Quezon and the Frieders. McNutt didn't come into the picture until 1937, but still he came as a high-ranking official. He was very much a can-do kind of guy. They all jumped into action, and a plan was established to allow Jews in. Everyone was concerned that there not be a flood of refugees that were unskilled, that were going to be a burden on the Philippine society. Neither the Philippines nor the Americans, who had any influence in immigration policy, were interested in that. I mean, immigration policy is, again, something that's very much the same today as it was then, it is always. The plan was established that the Frieders agreed. There was a refugee committee established, a Jewish refugee committee established, and that Jewish refugee committee was in charge of, first of all, they placed ads in German newspapers, in German Jewish newspapers, saying there were places available for Jews to emigrate to the Philippines if you had certain skills. There were 14 different categories. And people answered these ads, put a dossier together, and they sent it to the Philippines. And that dossier was reviewed by my grandfather or whatever Frieder member or whatever members of the Jewish Refugee Committee were there at the time. Yes, we can fill a position for this. We can get this person a job. We really want so-and-so, but we'll find them a job when they get here. Not only did they find them jobs and housing, they supplied housing. So the Jewish group agreed to take care of these people when they approved who could come in. Once those names were approved, McNutt had to get visas. They had to get American visas. So McNutt advocated, supported, very strongly endorsed this program. And he fought the State Department. Any pushback that he might have had from the State Department, he pushed against that, and he wrote and got visas for the number of Jews saved is 1,300 Jews came to the Philippines.
I was thinking when you were talking about how they had to more or less screen people according to their skills, job qualifications, all that. And I'm thinking, okay, you've got people that are coming from Central Europe to the Far Eastern tropics. And I'm thinking, boy, there's a culture shock for you. These people are coming from a temperate to pretty cold climate that's industrial, going to a place where there's sugarcane and tobacco, not a lot of industry. He must have really had to pull some strings or get real creative to get these people qualified to be admitted.
There were differences in European life and this colonial life, but at the same time, Manila isn't a farming town. Manila was a cosmopolitan city. There were jobs in the provinces, but Jews, refugees, emigres can adapt. I mean, they are fleeing for their lives, and they will come and they will do and they will survive.
Oh, I figured that. It was the process of getting them across through the screening process, but obviously Mr. McNutt was a big fan of this program, so he apparently went to bat and stood up for this and got them in, even that you indicated there was some opposition from the State Department.
Yes, anti-Semitic sentiment in the State Department's been well established. There have been oodles of books written about it. That's absolutely true. The United States was not allowing a lot of Jews in. They were
into the U.S. or
into the United States, which is another interesting aspect of allowing them into the Philippines. As a territory, it's still not the continental United States.
Yes. Oh, so that's where the resistance came from. It was religious prejudice.
Yes.
Oh, gosh, you never think about that sort of thing. Well, go ahead. This is great.
We're doing this film because we want the world to know that there were American Jews helping other Jews who did not have to do that. We want the world to know that the Philippines stood up and accepted Jews in a time when almost no other country did so. This is a story in the Holocaust record that is virtually unknown, even within Holocaust scholars. Everyone knows the story of Schindler, and the reason everyone knows that story is because of the film.
Right.
Schindler was a hero, and he did an amazing thing, and he saved 1,200 Jews. There really is a list, Schindler's List, and it's in the Holocaust Museum in Israel. That Holocaust Museum is called Yad Vashem, and there's that actual list. But everyone knows that story because of the film, and there was a book before that film, and still no one knew about it. And there was a book about this rescue effort on behalf of the Philippines and McNutt and the Frieders. But again, not everyone reads books. The book was published in 1996, I believe. In 2005, there was a weekend in Cincinnati, Ohio, organized by the Holocaust Museum in Cincinnati that brought together everyone associated with this story. It brought together descendants of President Kazan, descendants of McNutt, descendants of the Frieder brothers. It brought in refugees who had left their Germany, Austria, etc., and gone to the Philippines as children. They were in 2005, they were in their late 70s, let's say. And it brought together American servicemen who were in the Philippines during this critical period of time and ran into the refugees as children. There are Americans liberated the Philippines from Japanese occupation in 1945, and many of those liberators stayed for a number of months. If they were Jewish or even if they weren't Jewish, many of them helped rebuild the only temple on American soil that was destroyed in World War II. That was in Manila.
Well, now bring us to what may be one of the more fascinating aspects of this. When the Japanese came in and took over the Philippines, the American troops had to leave. What happened to this group of Jewish refugees that was there?
Japan was part of the Axis, but Japan did not endorse the German anti-Semitic policy, agree with that particular aspect of the German philosophy. And so when they took over in the Philippines, they rounded up and interned all people who were citizens of enemy countries. And those people were Americans, they were British, they were Australian, French, anyone in those nationalities. If you had a passport from an enemy country, you were interned. They weren't death camps, but they were internment camps. Mm-hmm. If you were a member of an Axis country, you were not. And so as Germans, the Jews who came to Manila to escape Nazi tyranny were not interned by the Japanese.
See, that's amazing to me. As brutal as the Japanese were in many other respects, and being partners with Germany and Italy, I would have assumed that Jews there would be the first ones to go into a prison camp or be detained in some way, and yet because they had immigrated from Germany, they were allowed to just do business as usual?
Business as usual did not exist after the Japanese invaded, and life was hard, and life changed both inside the internment camps and outside the internment camps as the war progressed.
What happened to McNutt? Was he there when they occupied the Philippines?
No, McNutt left. Foreign service terms are 2-year terms. So his term as High Commissioner was from 37 to 39. And he left in 39 to come back to the United States and run for president.
Okay.
That is important to our story in terms of the fate of the Jews and the fate of the immigration policy, allowing Jews into the Philippines. When McNutt left, there was a new High Commissioner appointed, and this new High Commissioner did not have the same feeling about, he did not endorse, support, advocate for the immigration policy the way McNutt did, and therefore it stalled. Mm-hmm. It did not go away, but it did stall.
Well, of course, 39 was the year that the German tanks rolled into Poland, and then shortly afterward France, and then everything came apart at the seams and the war was on. So that was a critical time. What about the president of the Philippines?
Well, the president of the Philippines continued to endorse the program, and Jews did continue to come in throughout 39 and 40. I don't think in 41 very much. But the doors to Germany, or the doors out of Germany, did not literally close until early 1941, I think. So there was still an opportunity to get out if you had a sponsor in the Philippines and you could get enough money to pay for your passage. Initially in Germany, their position on Jews was, we do not want them in our country. If anyone else will take them, fine.
That's amazing. Barbara, I was just going to ask that question. Did the Germans interfere with Jews leaving Germany? I was always under the impression that they just wanted them out, so they would probably be happy if there was some kind of refugee programs.
No, they didn't stop the Jews from leaving. They wanted the Jews to leave. On the other hand, they didn't do anything to help the situation. They said, depending on the date you left, you could either take your belongings and your money with you or not. And I don't remember the exact date that it started where you could only leave with this amount of mark and certain amount of stuff. So the laws in Germany against Jews began in 1933, and subsequently every so often there was a harsher and harsher and harsher rule against them. The Jews that left decided that it was too dangerous to stay. The Jews that stayed often felt, either they were too old to leave, they just couldn't believe their country was doing this to them, and they certainly could not envision the death camps that were going to come into existence in 1942. Most people, I don't know if most people are aware of the time frame, but the death camps in Germany did not start until 1942, 43.
I thought it was earlier than that. Now, Hollywood did a similar thing. They brought many, many Jews over, and of course everybody that was artistic started getting out as soon as Hitler came into power. You know, that's why some of the greatest directors and people in films we have immigrated from Europe. And we had those wonderful Germanic looking films. And through the movies they made, they helped build up support for the British and for the Jews and for the war to get America in. What happened with your relatives, the Frieders, during all of this?
My relatives, well, again, there was an every 2-year cycle. So only one family or possibly two during some couple of months overlap is going to be there at the same time. So in 1940, it was Herbert Frieder's term. My grandfather's Alex Frieder. He left in 39. And in late 1940, it was Herbert Frieder's time to be there. And he did not want to come back. But by that time, Paul McNutt was back in the United States, and he was in the FDR administration. And he said, it's very dangerous over there. He said to family members in Cincinnati, you've got to get Herbert and the kids out of there. And they said, well, he doesn't want to come home. And
he was there and he wasn't afraid?
He was not privy to the inside military information. He just didn't know what was going to come when. But Paul McNutt told the family, you've got to get him out of there, trick him, whatever you have to do. And so that's what the family in Cincinnati did. They cabled him or called him or whatever you did at that time, and they said, your mother's sick, you've got to come home.
Oh, that's a good one.
And so that brought Herbert and his family over. But then there was Philip Frieder, who was the oldest, and he had no children. And he stayed until late 1941, as did the next generation. There was a son-in-law who had joined the family business, so he and his wife were over there too. I don't know who told them to get out, but somebody did. Whether it was Eisenhower, it might have been Eisenhower. Eisenhower was a friend of the family.
They got out before the Japanese took over?
October of 1941, they took what is determined to be the last boat out of Manila, and they went through waters close to Hawaii, and they had to do a blackout. And they were in radio silence and a blackout for a certain period of time. When they got safely to San Francisco, they were delayed because they had to change their route. And when they didn't get back until, I think, after Pearl Harbor, they were at sea longer than normal. I mean, nobody knew exactly, but it's hypothesized that there were Japanese boats at sea, and they had to avoid that. It was very, very close to Pearl Harbor. All Frieder family members were out of the Philippines before Pearl Harbor. And we did go back after the war, after 1945, to see if the cigar business could be reestablished. But it was determined that wasn't possible. All of the tobacco fields had been flooded for rice. Lands that the tobacco factories had been on had been confiscated. And so we did not reestablish the cigar business in the Philippines. What did happen is the family member that went over there, his name was Abe Mandel, and he had married a Frieder girl. He was an actor, and he decided that he could get into the movie business. There wasn't much to do in the Philippines, and they all liked to go to the movies. My grandfather, Alex, with Abe, established the East Asian Frieder Film Company. And that is why I now call my company Frieder Films.
Wow. When did you first know about this? Did you know about this as a little girl?
I did. Thank you for bringing that up. Well, not as a little girl. As I said, everyone went over. All the Frieder boys took their wives and children over there. And in fact, in 1926, my mother was born in the Philippines. She was the youngest of 3 girls. And every 2 years, she would take a boat back and forth to the Philippines. And it was her father's 2-year term to run the cigar business in the Philippines during the critical immigration years from 37 to 39. And so she was a teenager. She was 12 or 13 years old at the time. And she was there. She tells the story in the film of her going to school in the morning and at noon, she would leave school and she would go by the factory to pick up her father to go home for lunch. But he was never ready because he was going over the lists. And the Jewish community had promised Kazan that they would only bring in people who could contribute to the economy. And that put them in a very difficult position in terms of choosing. I can't imagine, being in a position saying, I know this person's in Germany. If I let them come, they'll be all right. And if I don't, they may not. But that was the position they placed themselves in.
So you heard these stories as a young girl or as a teenager. That's, your mom being born over there and everything. I mean, that's like a really close link. I didn't make that connection in the beginning, your grandfather, but you were practically there yourself. When did you really start researching all this to bring it to the point of making a film?
In 2005, there was this reunion, weekend's worth of events that highlighted the story, honored the Philippines, honored McNutt, and honored the Frieders.
And that was in Cincinnati.
And honored Eisenhower, actually. I want to tell you the story about Eisenhower. But yes, that was in Cincinnati in 2005. And that kind of brought the story back into the front of my mind. And then a couple of years later, I went to the Holocaust Museum in Cincinnati, and they had a display of the rescue, and that was after Schindler's List. And I said, well, this story, these people saved as many people as Schindler. The world should know about this. And the way to do that is to do a compelling visual story. I had the time, so I decided I would embark on it. I don't know anything about filmmaking, or I didn't know anything about filmmaking, and I'm certainly not behind the camera. I don't do the interviews, but I do know how to organize, and I can call people on the phone. I want the world to know about this story. I want them to know what an honorable person Manuel Kazan was, what moral courage, the moral courage that was displayed by all the characters in this story. I want the world to know that people of different religions, people of different ethnicities can work together for the good of the human race. This isn't the first story of its kind, but you can never have too many.
Philippines, just the contrast between Central Europe and the Philippines of all things and all places, and this one family realizing what's going on and working with the State Department, the president of the Philippines, in a country that's kind of in limbo between its independence and being a colonial settlement of the U.S. is fascinating. After your relatives left, now they had brought in 1,300 people there. So there was obviously a Jewish colony, so to speak. Now, what happened with that? Did they continue to grow, or did they eventually leave? Or are they still a large part of the Philippines?
There is still a Jewish community in Manila today, but it's not composed of the people that went to the Philippines escaping the Nazis. The people that did that, for the most part, were not going to the Philippines because they wanted to go to the Philippines. They wanted to come to the United States, and they could not get in. So most of them came to the United States after the war. Some of them went to Israel. Some of them went to Australia. Some of them actually went back to Germany, and a very few of them stayed in the Philippines. And I've spoken to a number of people that were born in the Philippines whose parents emigrated during this 37 to 41 time period and stayed, and these people were born and raised in the Philippines until they were teenagers, and now they're in the States now. That's the story of what's happened to that Jewish community.
Now, you mentioned earlier you had a good story about Dwight Eisenhower.
Yes. So my family met Eisenhower in the Philippines. Eisenhower was there under MacArthur to build the Philippine Army from 1935 to 39. And that's 4 years. He was a lieutenant colonel at the time. And he worked hard during the day, very hard during the day. He had a very good relationship with Kazan and with McNutt, but his evenings were free. And so he would come to the house for card games. My mother tells the story of Mamie Eisenhower sitting in her mother's bedroom or dressing room and combing her bangs. Now, when the women were there, it was bridge. When it was just men, it was poker. So they became friends there. And Eisenhower, during these poker games, during these bridge games, they must have discussed what was going on during the day and what they were doing, and the rescue plan had to be discussed, although Eisenhower does not write about it. Eisenhower does write about one very critical time, that he was offered a job. He doesn't mention the Frieders by name, but he was offered, he says in his book, At Ease, he was offered a job. They were going to give him a salary of $60,000 in escrow for 5 years to manage the refugee program.
Well, I'll be.
So he had to know about the program if he was offered the job to manage them. And this job offer came in 1938, before he left the Philippines. He declined that offer. He wanted to stay in the military, and I'm pleased that he did. Those friendships that were established in the Philippines were maintained throughout Eisenhower's life. Well, Eisenhower gave our family a painting he painted. Mm-hmm. And we have in our family, there is one of his paintings. We sent him cigars every year throughout his presidency. We have thank you notes from the White House. There were letters written back and forth between my grandfather and Ike of a personal nature. We have a letter from Ike from headquarters. In 1945, my grandmother died before June of 45, before D-Day. It was in February, I believe. And there's a personal letter from Ike, wherever he was in Europe, sending his condolences to my grandfather on the death of his wife. All the Frieder family members were invited to all the inaugurations. When Eisenhower came to Cincinnati one time, he was staying at the local hotel, and one of the Frieder family members went down, and they let him in, and he turned around and said, "Oh, hi, Janie." It was not a superficial relationship.
Wow, that is just fascinating. Now, I've seen the trailer. How can people go and look at what's come along so far?
We have a website, www.rescueinthephilippines.com. No spaces, of course. If one goes to that website, you can see some of the history of the film. You get a narrative of the story. We have some photos that we've collected that are interesting. Eisenhower photos, Frieder family member photos, Kazan, McNutt, anything related to the story. And that will be added to over time. We have documents on there that we found during our research. A letter from Alex to Ike talking about how wonderful Alex thinks Ike is and how he knows he's going to win the war and it's going to be wonderful. Memos from McNutt with names on them. These names have been approved for visas. State Department write these visas. And we've interviewed people whose names are on that list. And there are videos. There's just a short trailer, 45 seconds, if that's all you want to see. Or we have 18 minutes of what will be our final hour-long version in the video section. And of course, there's an opportunity to donate, because we're working with the Holocaust Museum in Cincinnati to raise the money for this film. It's a budget of just under $1 million. We've raised just over $700,000 so far. We are finished with production. We've done all our interviews. We've interviewed like about 30 people who were children at the time and have lived this story. We've interviewed Eisenhower's granddaughter. We've interviewed McNutt's distant relative. We've interviewed Frieder family members. We've interviewed Kazan family members. We have the story down start to finish. It's Three Roads Communications' job to put that in a visually compelling way, which I think from the 18 minutes, you will see that they're very good at that.
Well, what I saw, I thought, wow, I want to see this. And, you know, it's kind of like Casablanca meets Schindler's List, but it's Frieder's List. And I'm sure that it's going to take off. But the purpose of it, I had no idea. I want to thank you. That was just really just riveting. I mean, I just sat here absorbing all this and could almost see it. And having seen portions of the trailer, I could visualize it. Thank you so much for bringing this to our attention.
It's wonderful to have the opportunity to tell the story. In telling this story, I'm often asked, what's the most surprising thing you've learned in doing the research? And the most surprising thing I've learned is how much Kazan personally believed in the humanity, in the fact that it's the right thing to do to save these people. They deserve to live the life as they think they should. And he displayed this in so many ways. First, just by saying, the Jews can come to my country. Secondly, he donated his own personal land in 2 different locations for them to settle. There was some land he had just outside Manila that was supposed to be given to his son when President Kazan died, and he apportioned part of that as a farming community for the Jews to live on. He built a residence for them to live there and to farm. And this was modeled after the farming kibbutz model in Palestine, in what is now Israel, that Jews would go and they would farm and they would make the land fertile and they would live off that. So that was a model for this particular property, and it was Kazan's personal land. And we have video of the dedication of this residence and farmland. And then secondly, his son was at high school age at the time. President Kazan's son was in high school, and he went to LaSalle University in the Philippines. University is a high school. But in any case, there was a Jewish refugee who was also at that school, and those 2 boys became good friends. Kazan sent a limousine to go pick up this poor Jewish refugee on the weekends and bring him to the palace where he spent weekends with his son. Kazan had Jews around him a lot. He had a Jewish physician. He allowed that Jewish physician to sponsor his family members who came over to the Philippines from Germany later. He had Jewish friends and advisors. And so I just think all these things show that Kazan was not letting the Jews in just because maybe they could contribute to his country's economy, although that didn't hurt. He really believed in this idea that all men are created equal, and he acted on it.
That is refreshing to hear.
Yes, yes. And the other thing I wanted to say go back to the donate page. So we are working with a nonprofit in Cincinnati, the Holocaust Center. It's the Center for Holocaust and Humanity Education. And any contributions to the film made through them are tax deductible. There's a dedicated account that will go to the film, and we're almost finished. I mean, we're going to get this done, and we're going to get it on television, and we're going to go to the film festivals, and who knows what the future will hold once a story is out there. There's a lot of excitement throughout the Holocaust community that this story be told. We invite everyone at whatever level you might want to make a contribution. We'll get it done.
Well, Barbara, thank you so much. That just is an absolutely compelling story. And hopefully we have a lot of people that listen that are history buffs and Galvestonians that would more than likely want to contribute something to this. It sounds pretty easy. And again, you're just a storehouse of information. I've just been sitting here hanging on every word because there's so many components to this story, and I think it's a very worthwhile thing, and it needs to get out there. So thank you.
Well, thank you, George. I'm really excited to have the opportunity to share this story with a larger audience as your radio show allows. If anyone wants to ask me any questions, I'm available. They go to the website and they can send me an email on Frieder Films, info@friederfilms.com. So.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, George.